Welcome back to Pan-African Lens, where we dive into the geopolitical stories shaping Africa today. In a recent and unexpected development, Burkina Faso has recalled its ambassadors from Ivory Coast. This surprising move has raised eyebrows across the region and beyond, signaling a deepening of tensions between these two neighboring West African nations. Could this be the tipping point in a simmering crisis that has been quietly unfolding for years? And what does this say about the current state of African geopolitics, particularly between nations like Burkina Faso, Ivory Coast, and their contrasting allegiances? Today, we'll unpack the complex dynamics that led to this diplomatic fallout, focusing on the political landscape, the role of foreign influence, especially France, and the broader implications for West Africa's stability. Could this escalation lead to a broader crisis? Or is there still room for reconciliation? Let's dive in. To understand the significance of this moment, we need to look back to 2022, when Ibrahim Traore came to power in Burkina Faso. Since then, the country has been on a trajectory that has profoundly reshaped its foreign relations, particularly with former colonial powers like France. Traore's government has taken a firm anti-colonial stance, positioning itself in opposition to what many see as France's lingering influence in the region. This shift hasn't sat well with certain West African leaders, especially President Alassane Ouattara of Ivory Coast, a leader seen by many as a close ally of France. This tension has been bubbling beneath the surface, but Burkina Faso's decision to recall its ambassadors marks a significant escalation. What's behind this dramatic move? And how deep do the fractures between these two countries run? Before we continue, welcome to Pan-African Lens. If you're passionate about Africa's diverse cultures, rich history, development, and the contemporary issues shaping the continent and its diaspora, you've come to the right place. Be sure to subscribe and join the conversation as we explore these powerful stories together. Let's continue. To truly grasp the current diplomatic crisis, it's essential to understand how Alassane Ouattara came to power in Ivory Coast. Ouattara's rise to the presidency in 2011 came after a contentious and bloody election crisis. His predecessor, Laurent Gbagbo, refused to concede defeat in the 2010 presidential elections, leading to a brutal civil war that left thousands dead. The international community, led by France, intervened in the conflict, supporting Ouattara's claim to the presidency. French forces played a decisive role in ousting Gbagbo, who was eventually arrested and sent to the International Criminal Court, ICC, in The Hague on charges of crimes against humanity. After a long trial, Gbagbo was acquitted in 2019, but the scars of France's heavy-handed involvement in Ivorian politics remain. Many see Ouattara as a puppet president, installed by France to protect its interests in the region. This history sets the stage for the current tension between Burkina Faso and Ivory Coast. As Burkina Faso distances itself from France and seeks new alliances with countries like Russia, Ouattara has maintained his close relationship with French President Emmanuel Macron, fueling suspicions in Ouagadougou about Ivory Coast's role in destabilizing the region. One of the primary reasons cited for Burkina Faso's decision to recall its ambassadors is its long-standing accusation that Ivory Coast has been harboring Burkinabe politicians and ex-military figures intent on destabilizing Traore's government. Since Ibrahim Traore took power, his government has repeatedly pointed fingers at Ivory Coast, accusing the country of serving as a safe haven for those plotting against Burkina Faso. It's worth noting that Burkina Faso isn't the only country making such accusations. Niger, another member of the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, has also accused Benin, a close ally of Ivory Coast, of harboring French troops intent on undermining Niger's stability. As AES countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger pivot towards Russia and distance themselves from Western influence, the more these accusations seem to arise. This alignment with Russia is seen as a direct threat to Western hegemony in the region, especially by countries like Ivory Coast and Benin, who have long been closely tied to France. But why would these nations go so far as to risk regional instability by allegedly harboring coup plotters and terrorists? To further illustrate the underlying tensions, let's look at the pipeline crisis between Niger and Benin, which is emblematic of the larger geopolitical struggle unfolding in West Africa. Niger, another AES country, has been at odds with Benin over a pipeline project that is crucial for its economic growth. Niger accuses Benin of sabotaging the project to serve French interests, and there have been allegations that French troops stationed in Benin are actively working to destabilize Niger's government. This crisis mirrors the accusations Burkina Faso is making against Ivory Coast. Just as Niger sees Benin as a puppet of France, Burkina Faso views Ivory Coast through a similar lens, suspecting that its leadership is more concerned with protecting French interests than fostering genuine regional cooperation. Could these tensions escalate into something more? Or will diplomacy prevail before it's too late? There's also a more personal dimension to the current crisis. Alassane Ouattara, like many African leaders of his generation, is deeply fearful of the wave of military coups sweeping through West Africa. He belongs to an older generation of leaders who came to power through elections, often backed by Western nations, and see military coups as a direct threat to their own legitimacy. Ouattara's hardline stance against the AES countries, particularly his support for ECOWAS sanctions on military-led governments in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, has only deepened the divide. Ouattara was one of the most vocal ECOWAS leaders pushing for military intervention in Niger, following the recent coup there, further alienating Burkina Faso and its allies. For leaders like Ouattara, these coups represent a dangerous precedent that could threaten their own grip on power. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn. While Ouattara and other ECOWAS leaders have adopted a combative stance, many Ivorians themselves support Ibrahim Traore and the AES leaders. On social media, you'll find countless Ivorian citizens praising Traore's bold leadership and expressing their wish for a similar leader to rise in Ivory Coast. This growing sentiment of Pan-African solidarity suggests that the tension between Burkina Faso and Ivory Coast's governments may not reflect the views of the people themselves. To his credit, Ibrahim Traore has repeatedly made it clear that his issue isn't with the people of Ivory Coast, but with their leadership. Traore has emphasized that Burkina Faso values its relationship with the Ivorian people and that his government's grievances lie squarely with President Ouattara's administration. This is an important distinction, as it highlights the broader disconnect between West African elites and the citizens they govern. Many ordinary Ivorians see Traore as a hero, a young, dynamic leader unafraid to stand up to Western powers and forge a new path for Africa. Meanwhile, Ouattara represents an older generation of leaders who, in the eyes of many, are too beholden to foreign interests. While AES countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have been driving out French troops in an effort to reclaim their sovereignty, Ivory Coast has taken a different path. In fact, tensions between Burkina Faso and Ivory Coast were further inflamed last month when a French warship arrived in Abidjan, fully equipped with military personnel and gear for a new military base. Officially, the base is meant to help fight piracy in the Gulf of Guinea, but the timing of this development, when other African nations are distancing themselves from French military influence, was seen as a provocative move by Burkina Faso. The arrival of French troops in Ivory Coast stands in stark contrast to the broader trend of African countries rejecting foreign military presence. Burkina Faso has been vocal in its opposition, with Traore's government accusing Ivory Coast of further deepening its ties to France at a time when regional autonomy should be the priority. Adding to the complexity, Burkina Faso, like other AES nations, has taken steps to restrict the influence of Western media. Several media outlets, including Voice of America, VOA, have been suspended for what the Burkinabe government described as biased and misleading reporting. Western media outlets have been accused of misrepresenting the efforts of Burkina Faso's armed forces in their fight against terrorism, with claims that some of their reports were intended to undermine the morale of both Burkinabe and Malian forces. This media blackout is another reflection of the growing tension between AES countries and the West. By limiting the influence of Western narratives, Burkina Faso is signaling its intent to control its own story and ensure that its people are not swayed by external propaganda. What's next for West Africa? So where does this leave us? The diplomatic crisis between Burkina Faso and Ivory Coast is more than just a bilateral issue. It's a reflection of the larger geopolitical struggle playing out across West Africa. As Burkina Faso and other AES nations align themselves more closely with Russia and move away from French influence, countries like Ivory Coast and Benin remain tethered to their former colonial rulers. This divide is reshaping the political landscape of the region, with far-reaching implications for the future of West African stability. At the same time, the internal dynamics within these countries are shifting. While leaders like Ouattara cling to the old order, many of their citizens are looking to leaders like Ibrahim Traore for inspiration. Could this growing disconnect between the people and their governments lead to further instability? Or will we see a new wave of Pan-African unity as the younger generation demands more independence from foreign powers? We'll be watching these developments closely, so make sure to subscribe to Pan-African Lens for more updates on this unfolding story. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. How do you see this diplomatic crisis playing out? Could it lead to a broader regional conflict? Or is there still hope for reconciliation between Burkina Faso and Ivory Coast? Thank you for watching Pan-African Lens. If you enjoyed this video and want to continue celebrating Africa's heritage and discussing its future, please like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps grow our community and keeps the conversation alive. See you in the next video.